We'll start. Okay, Edward, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, DC History and Culture. Thank you for participants. I paused for a moment to consider how to say this. With great respect to the people of the Ukraine, the topics that we're talking today cannot be seen singly in and of by themselves without thinking about how empire still, after 400 years of colonialism, still continues. For those of you who know my history, I do work in related areas, and it will be hard to have this conversation today without understanding the connection. If dominion, what history teaches, human and non-human animal relations in Western thought, the conversation that I have in other presentations here is how animal relations, cages, chains, collars, enslavement, and suppression factor not only in Nazi Germany, not only in the United States, but as you can see, not only in animals, but in the way we treat other human animals. My name is Edward Ingebretson, Georgetown University and other sorts of places. Robert Kellerman is our host, and thank you. In a previous webinar, The Sense of an Ending, the Sixth Extinction, this is number 2 in the series, we reviewed the way of the world will end. And this, of course, includes the animals, the four-legged and two, because we are animals, and we'll talk about that, who live more or less together in it. In this presentation, I briefly investigate how animals, four-legged and two, live together in this world, and as we can see, sometimes don't live, and why. This was the previous, and it's also as a webinar, and it's also been recorded. Some starter questions. What do we think about animals? And usually now, when I speak about animals in this kind of sense, it's the kind of the sense that we have of animals, cows and horses and pets. We don't include ourselves, of course, because most of us don't make the connection that since 1757 with Carl Linnaeus, we are in fact put back into the biological tree as two-legged animals. We're all sentient. The hard question then is, how does this affect how we think about other humans? And again, it will be hard to distract or to remove what I'm talking about from a very different context, which I teach in other webinars. Dominion, a word out of the Christian New Testament, and we'll talk about that. Who taught us to think this way? What can or should we change about how we think about non-human animals? And who speaks for animals? Who speaks for now? Let's say, who speaks for Ukraine? Who speaks for the animals in Ukraine? Who speaks for all the devastation that dominion still causes us? The presentation examines a vexed interchange between the humans and animals, and specifically commodity culture, bodies for sale, bodies for purchase. We encounter animals daily, although we pay little attention, possibly, and maybe not. Even if we go to a place like Whole Foods, do we even recognize these encounters as encounters? We eat animals, we wear them, our beauty, health, and home products are tested on them. They perform for us. They satisfy our needs for intimacy, as well as novelty. Human agency and indifference removes animals from their natural lives and displays them for a variety of human pleasures, often mixed. But in what sense can we say that we own them? And in what sense can we say that we owe them? Western culture, a mix of theology and empire, generally, positions non-human animals as subservient to humans, and in post-colonial rhetoric will subjugate their bodies in the same discursive frame that gave Harriet Beecher Stowe the subtitle for Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Man Who Was a Thing. A way of starting some very basic questions. And we're not going to answer these questions, but it just gives a sense of, as I begin to try and develop this, what rights should non-human animals have? Do we ever think in that kind of context? And For many folks, this may be a question that we have a kind of a sentimentalized notion of that. I mean, for example, here in DC, there are 5 major universities, and we have all sorts of kinds of policy wonks who want to go in and change laws around animals. But nowhere in any of the universities do you even get this kind of material that we're talking about here. So we end up having this notion of animals are cute. So there's a sort of sentimental, I like animals, but then we don't know where else we should do with that. Should aesthetic considerations, how cute an animal species is, affect decisions about rights in animal lives? Very often it does. In Spain, for example, apes have been given special rights in part because they are genetically close to humans. And Europe, and as we go forward, is way ahead of the United States in this matter. Should apes and monkeys have more what Peter Singer would call considerations than other animals? And what, if anything, makes us non-human, us human animals, special or exceptional? One looks at the news and one wonders. Do animals have emotions? If we have a pet, have we ever noticed it express what we consider an emotion? Do animals think? Now, many of these questions are designed to be provocative, and they're not here to do anything else except to say that when we were starting to talk about this, some of the ways in which non-human animals go under the radar, if you want, in our particular lives is thinking about, well, it's obvious, what do you think about wearing fur? We'll immediately say, no, thank you. The very funny image of Jon Snow in the Game of Thrones, and he's all wrapped up in these furs, and people were getting all, to use the expression, on their high horse. And then the producer said, "Oh no, this is fake stuff from IKEA." So we had to laugh. Many people believe that factory farming is a cruel and unnecessary practice, and that our roads and our diets would be healthier. There is, in fact, science behind that. And Peter Singer says, the one thing that we can immediately change ethically is factory farming, because it's neither a factory nor is it a farm. Keeping animals as pets or in zoos or in circuses is selfish, unnatural, and inhumane. This is the hard stuff. And I have no questions about it. My husband and I have 4 strays, and one is sitting here now who is 16 years old, and he's a dependent unit. And, you may on occasion hear him decide that he wants to participate. So we all have these kinds of, I'm calling them vexed relationships with animals and non-human animals. And what about this? Should it be changed? If it should be changed, and where does it come from? Who taught us to think the way that we do? The 3 points I'm going to speak about directly today are philosophy and theology. And in particular, we're going to look at Aristotle and the geopolitics, as I'm calling it, of Genesis. Go and conquer and hold all in submission. And we can see that being played out now in our current history. A human empire, the need to conquer and have dominion. Commodity and culture, the hard one, because we forget that the things that we're wearing, the things that we're eating, and how we live, and we say, oh, well, we really can't do without these. And then we look, just for example, to talk about food, and at the way that meat eating is gendered in our culture. Just look at the ads. Women are not targeted, to use that word, sorry, with ads for meat eating. Men are, and it works. So an observation, and already I have been observing this throughout. To begin, what we're talking about is not about the animals themselves so much as the cultural practices, the cultural use of non-human animals, and how this use applies in equal measure to our treatment of human animals. To think about non-human animals, we start with Western hierarchical values, and they are Western. They're colonial. They're largely European. Ideologies of human race and gender. The economics of how we have been trained to value, or as we see in the news, not value bodies. And again, if you hear at the side of this conversation, the conversation that fuels enslavement and Black Lives Matters, you will be on point. In fact, Alexei de Tocqueville, who was a witness to the removal of the Cherokees in 1831, he was there as a witness. Now, you will not ever see this in an American studies class. With a degree in American studies, I will tell you this, that while we quote de Tocqueville and Democracy in America, we rarely understand that Democracy in America is for him an ironic title. This is what he says. Might one say, quote, that the European is to men of other races what man is to the animals. He makes them serve his convenience, and when he cannot bend them to his will, he destroys them. In one low oppression, he has deprived the descendant of the Africans of almost all of the privileges of humanity. I could read that again, but I won't. The European colonialists believed that the white race, and white in scare quotes because they would not have thought about it in that type of a word, had proven its superiority by bringing, quote, the lower races under its command. And the lower races is Kipling's 1898 expression. Once Western norms of rationality were defined as the essence of humanity and social norm, by first using non-human animals as the measure of otherness, it's just a short step to begin doing odd, different, exotic, eccentric, or external state people as non or subhuman. Back in 1938, before the Nazi regime could dehumanize the Jewish peoples, they had to dehumanize them first. And they did this in terms by turning them into animals, bugs. You know, you've seen the advertisements. Polygenesis was a theological defense of enslavement. That is to say, there was one Genesis in Genesis, and this was Adam and Eve, and these other people came from other kinds of places, and they were somehow not white, not different. In the right, Eternal Treblinka by Charles Patterson, in which he makes the sustained critical argument that links enslavement and the domesticity of animals. The first exiles from the moral community animals provided a convenient discard bin for oppressors to dispose of the oppressed. The connections are clear. Quote, for civilization built on the exploitation and slaughter of animals, in this case, human or non-human, the lower and more degraded the human victims are, the easier it is to kill them. The former president speaking about an incident in New York, because these animals deserve to be killed. Right there. Colonialism was, quote, a natural extension of human supremacy over the animal kingdom. For just as humans had subdued animals with their superior intelligence and technologies, so many Europeans believe still that the white race had proven its superiority by controlling the lower races. The need for empire continues. Marjorie Spiegel, The Dreaded Comparison, Human and Animal Enslavement. An astonishing book. It's maybe 100 pages long. Once perceived as brute beasts or subhumans occupying a lower evolutionary rung, and that's Thomas Jefferson, sorry, than white Westerners, subjected people were treated accordingly. Once characterized as animals, they could be hunted down like animals and shopped like animals. The point I make in my Enslaved series, stock market comes from the same people that gave you the stockyard. Why was it a stock market? Because this is exactly where the money came from. This is not happy history, but how did we get here? What does history teach us? And probably a question may give people pause. Whose voices do we use when we are speaking? When we are most determined that this is my own or our own opinion, are we sure? Who put that language, who put that philosophy into our head? Those who control words and define what can be said shape our knowledge. The geopolitics of Christianity, geo meaning geography, politics meaning the politics, the way we use the land. So dominion, what does that mean? And where do we get the word? We get it from Genesis. Let us make man in our own image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Genesis 1:2-6. And by the way, a creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth was the original, if you want to call it, creature in the Garden of Eden. And Eden simply means garden. The original, what we know now as a snake, was originally a four-footed creature in one of the earliest images. This first section is an exploration of this particular history, this biblical history that many people will misuse, not understand, and use this expression over here for things that it does not particularly mean. In Genesis, there are a couple accounts of creation. There are two. This first one, a careless reading suggests that God calls mankind, beginning with Adam and Eve, Adam, which simply means the man, to exercise dominion over the earth, subdue it, and develop its latent potential. We're called to fill the earth with His glory through creating what we commonly would call culture. The Hebrew word radah carries this idea of ruling, subduing, and exercising. This command is often called, and you see it often in the populist Christianity, called the cultural mandate, whereas I'm calling it the geopolitics, that it's never been nullified. It's still in effect, confirmed and expanded to Noah after the flood. But in the beginning, there was no dominion. And you go back and you look at the images and you see we started off with the Peaceable Kingdom by Edward Hicks, 1833. And this man had one idea and he did 62 of these particular paintings. But in the beginning, there was no dominion. Things were different. All sentient beings shared Eden together. Genesis 1, all creatures at peace and concord. And it's interesting to note, I'm laughing that heteropatriarchy is still at work, even in here. So while there are Western, quote, notions of race and gender that play out, one of them here is that all of us animals are, happily here together. And the longer issue is why human animals got removed from the biological tracking to begin with. And that's specifically church politics. And we're not going to have time to go into that today. Why, for example, until Carl Linnaeus, you would not find the human in any kind of biological mapping in that way. Again, Edward Hicks, the lion, wolf shall, this is a quote from Isaiah that he's working with. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the calf and the lion, the fatted calf together, a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. The nursing child shall play over the hole that cobra, the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy at all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Clearly, this is not a world in which we currently live. In hoache te noima tu theo kinatutan pano apo tenara. In the beginning, the spirit, the breath of the Lord moved over the waters. An originary narrative tells of a past with a politic. It confirms a present. A narrative of origins is more than just a story, so that when our kids ask us, when did you meet daddy, mommy? When did you do this? When did you do that? Our answer is probably truer to where we are now than we were then. But an originary narrative tells not only how things were, but it confirms the way things are. It is a conclusion. The book of Genesis, probably maybe 3,500 years later, still serves as this particular function, although we have removed it from its original communal expression for Jewish diaspora people and have made it serve a different kind of purpose. Moving away from that particular thing, that as what I would call the Christian, folkish Christian and Western largely now expression of this, puts a certain hierarchy in place. But it's a complicated thing, and we're not going to just take a moment here to it's a formative narrative shared by three religions, the Abrahamic religions, kind of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's a mix of images, and again, Eastern and Western are hard terms to think about here, but in terms of the ahimsa, which is a notion of do no harm, respect all life, meets developing Western requirements of property and land. And we see that in the book of Genesis itself, because it was never written just one, it was revised and revised and revised. And so, as we will see later chapters in Genesis, change that original narrative. And from the East, that very first thing that we just read, the original creation account, Noah's shepherding of the animals. And then Genesis 3, you have the snake. Cain and Abel, hierarchy of the food chain, hierarchy of domesticity of a nomadic hunter-gatherer lives, the sacrifice of Abraham. Benjamin Britten, and from that day forward, all the sons of Europe slew one by one. The war requiem. This is an aside, but this is what we forget, and this is another Edward Hicks. This is what we forget from Genesis. Behold, I have given to you all herbage yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree that has seed yielding fruit. It shall be yours for food. And to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, within which there is a living soul, every green herb is for food. Well, that's astonishing. So Genesis doesn't give us permission to eat meat, although it's often claimed that it does. One of the problems is the King James Version translates food, translates the word meat. We'll see that. So here is the word. How do you read it? Which is a paraphrase of Jesus to the Pharisees. Between Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 9. And to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, within which there is a living soul. All this is astonishing, isn't it? Every green herb is for food. A few chapters later. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. This is King James. Even as the green herb have I given you all things. But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. Even the King James gives us that prescription. So in the Old Testament, in the Abrahamic tradition, a righteous man regards the life of his animal, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. So significant voices through all of this. Augustine, by a more just usage of the ordinance of the Creator, both their animals' lives and their death are subject to our use. That's Augustine. Again, Augustine. And what is this God? I asked the earth, and it answered, I'm not God. All the things in the earth made the same confession. I asked the sea, the deeps, the creeping things, and they answered, we are not your God, seek higher. Neither are we God whom you seek. So I asked all these creatures, this entice the senses, tell me who this mysterious one that I search for. All cried out to me in one great voice, God made us and God made you. Moving ahead, certainly C.S. Lewis. It's certainly difficult to suppose that the apes, the elephant, the higher domestic animals have not in some degree a self or soul, which connects experience and gives rise to rudimentary individuality. So you're going to see throughout here, the notion of the various stories, and it is a conflict, and there is no one particular voice in Christianity and Judaism that talks about how we should be careful with other life, although the dominant feeling that one gets in this particular tradition is that all creatures, big and small, from the Episcopal verse. If you have men who, this is Francis, who exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you will have men who deal likewise with their fellow men. If you have men who exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you'll have men who deal likewise with their fellow men. All creatures have the same source as we have. Like us, they derive the life of thought, love, and will from the Creator. Not to hurt our humble brethren is our first duty to them, but to stop there is a complete misapprehension of the intentions of providence. Aquinas takes his line from Aristotle, essentially, and the West has Aristotle thanks to the Islamic Renaissance. And the only reason that the West has any kind of access to Greek philosophy was because it was translated through Islam and then brought into Europe. So Aquinas says, according to the divine ordinance, and he's using Aristotle here, the lives of animals and plants is preserved not for themselves, but for men. So utility. He denies that animals are proper object of moral concern for at least two reasons. God made animals exclusively for human use. We ride, wear, work, and eat animals, and there is no sin in using a thing for the purpose for which it is. They're there for our use. This form of utilitarianism is largely the argument that we see in commodity culture. John Wesley, good Methodist that he was, the very foundations of their nature are out of course, are turned upside down. This notion of the fallen world, and this is particularly a Protestant notion, as man is deprived of his perfection, his loving obedience to God, so brutes are deprived of their perfection, their loving obedience to man. So there is this notion that even the creatures, and you can see all of the particular creatures, and in this Dürer painting, that these different kinds of animals show different sorts of human beings, and the choleric human being, the wise human being. The most of the rest is set at open defiance, if it is the power. A few only, those whom we commonly call domestic animals, retain more or less of their original disposition, though with the mercy of God. Albert right here in Latin, signing it. St. John Paul recently, as much of a Marxist as this man was, one cannot use with impunity an exemption from punishment the different categories of beings, whether living or inanimate, animals, plants, the natural elements, simply as one wishes according to one's own economic needs. On the contrary, one must take into account the nature of each being and of its mutual connection in an ordered system, which is precisely the cosmos on social concern. And to this particular point, the current pontiff, I'm waiting for, if John Paul were still Pope, there would have been a statement from the Vatican pretty directly over the current aggression. The Eastern tradition is the tradition in which you have, again, all creatures, great and small. You have Jains and Buddhists and Hindus believe that animals should not be used by humans as food or for other purposes because there is some sacred kind of thing. And there are different reasons for this. With the belief in reincarnation, that a person is returned through human animals, and just the simple notion that they are in themselves indivisible and other and should not mistreated. Belief that ancestors return in animal form must be treated with respect. Openness to all creatures, principle of no harm, from the Sanskrit in Hindu, Vedist, Jain. Jains are the religious practice who will carry a mask over their face and will have a broom sweeping in front of them so they do not step on some living creature. So Greek culture is first Eastern in belief, and I think we forget that because we have westernized Aristotle, westernized Greek and Roman culture in terms of our own particular politic. But the culture itself is much more capacious and much wider than the dominion-focused hierarchical Western. Even in this image of Artemis and the animals, we hunt, but we acknowledge a mutuality. Plutarch in 46 was the Common Era. Can you really ask why Pythagoras had for abstaining from flesh? For my part, I rather wonder both by what accident and in what state of soul or mind of the first man who did so, touched his mouth to gore, and brought his lip to the flesh of a dead creature. I'm not going to read that next part. For the sake of a little flesh, we deprive them of sun, of light, of the duration of life to which they are entitled by birth and being. Then we go on to assume that they utter cries and squeaks. The just speech is inarticulate, and they do not, begging for mercy, entreating, seeking justice, each one of them saying, I do not ask to be spared in case of necessity, only spare me your arrogance, essentially saying, if you need to eat, to live, do so, but spare us the arrogance. The interesting thing that Plutarch says here, we go on to assume that they utter cries and squeaks, and their speech is inarticulate. I come back to Jefferson and to Washington and their comments in terms of Western enslavement, and the number of astonishing comments that Jefferson writes in Notes in Virginia. He says, well, they can't express themselves and we can't understand them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it says it's always easiest for dominion, for the colonizer, to say simply that these persons make no sense, they have no feelings, they have thicker skin than we do, they are theirs for us. Aristotle, and this again has been kind of written out of the record, developed a sort of psychological continuum, recognizing, quote, that human and non-human animals differ only by degree in possessing certain temperaments. He drew attention to resemblances in the physical organs, the difference, similarity of similar temperaments, gentleness or fierceness, mildness or cross-temper, courage or timidity. So Darwin will be, in this respect, himself, Aristotelian. Now, and I should say, Aristotle got lots of things wrong. We're not going to talk about that, but in this particular sense, while he himself, he did say that every living creature has within it eudaimonia, a good spirit, and a spirit needing to thrive. The great chain of being, and this is largely now more Western, a strictly hierarchical structure of all matter and life, believed to have been decreed by God, derived from Aristotle, Plato, but adapted wholesale by the scholastic church fathers. Wholesale here is a word purposely used to underestimate the commodity venture of how ideas came to serve cultural needs. And you can see here you see images of this on the Sistine Chapel, for example, all the way down, even down to the rocks and the trees, that there was a hierarchy here, that everything linked. So that's kind of the first session, and as the first section, and as I said, it's a quick walkthrough of dominion. So this is what Western culture teaches in different kinds of ways. There are different voices, but very often the voices that carry through are not the ones that say a difference of degree and not of kind, although perhaps increasingly so. But we spend our thinking on dominion, subordination, commodity. What does that mean? Roman law, religion, and political theory, dominion and subordination and commodity, these three general positions of thought regarding human versus non-human animal, derived from a complicated weave of ideas derived from ancient law, philosophy, and biblical culture. Res naturae, things of nature. In Roman law, the difference between a feral or a natural object and one that was owned was by putting a hand out and claiming it or touching it. A very interesting echo in the Me Too movement, and this notion of that claiming and possession, the work of empire, the work of colonialism, the work of taking, the work of subordinating, involves a reaching into a space and claiming it. Dominion, power and ownership of. Think race and think gender. Why do I say gender? Because race and gender were concepts brought from Europe and imposed upon, quote, the New World, which had been there much longer than the European one. And the cascading effects of race and gender are still, we're sorting out. Subordination, think property. There's a great book on pets, Dominion, Affection, and Subordination, is that it's very easy to be affectionate to an animal that you can essentially put into a cage and leave for 12 hours. It makes no claim on us. Commodity, think food, entertainment, and clothing. So the general point is that dominion gives us subordination and gives us commodity. And if we have to start thinking differently around that. So the history of history presumes and presupposes an unquestioned position of power. Speciesism, as Peter Singer would call it. No different than racism, sexism, ableism. It's a category that's placed without any kind of preceptual thought. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the earth, over the cattle. Dominion. A beautiful book written by Matthew Scully, a speechwriter for former President Bush. Dominion, the power of man, the suffering of animals, and the call to mercy. He's an evangelical Christian, and he understands dominion as well. He's very Aristotelian in the sense that these animals are given to us for our particular use, but he says the call for mercy. Every now and then you'll hear expression, well, I live in a very tolerant culture. And I will stop and say, you don't want to live in a culture that tolerates you. Welfare and mercy and tolerance, all of these political and social uses have in common, all require a power imbalance, all derive from dominion over. And I think even the language around diversity, because usually diversity suggests, if it doesn't outright say, that there is an unmarked center in the center that is somehow everything else, the outside edge is the diverse part of it. But to tolerate someone is to be able to say, I am bigger than you are, I have more rights than you do, I have more legal than you do, I can tolerate your behavior. That's a power. So in dominion, even when we speak about other humans, the language of relationship is important. Power over is hidden. Animal welfare theorists accept that animals have interests, but they allow these interests to be traded away as long as there's some human benefits. Peter Singer would counter that partly. He would say that equal consideration, that every species deserves equal consideration. And we'll say, well, my dog can't sign a contract or my cat can't sign a contract, so I should pay no attention. I said, our children can't sign contracts either. That nonetheless does not end our moral claim to treat these creatures, our children, and actually that's from Aristotle, who talks about children as you can almost consider children as almost human. They're creatures and they're becoming human, and whatever you want to do with that particular language, but that it's a notion that our moral claim on our ethical mercy, our ethicalness, and I go back now to what's happening in the Ukraine, does not stop with an ability of contractual ability to be equal in this. Equal consideration of all species. Animal rights, equal considerations means that animals, like humans, have interests that cannot be sacrificed or traded away just because it might benefit others. And the shorthand of this, and for example, the former president comes in and evacuates any of the kind of the laws around hunting, ivory, and animal killing and wolf that Mr. Obama had placed in before him, because one, we needed the land, two, it was interfering with logging or whatever the thing might be. Are there places where this adjudication has to be made? Absolutely. However, the rights position does not hold that rights are absolute. An animal's rights, like those of humans, must be limited, and rights can certainly conflict. But still, animals are not ours to use for food, clothing, entertainment, or experimentation. Or I should say, non-human animals, or are the human animals ours to use for food, clothing, entertainment, experimentation? Gary Francione, Introduction to Rights Animals, Your Child or the Dog. His point here is that that if you're in a fire situation, which species do you say first? Very simple ethical point, kin and kind. In bioethics, understanding that when one says to a child, don't hit him, he's your sister, he's your brother, whatever the thing might be, one would say, well, why does one have to say, don't hit them, and then pose the relationship? Don't invade these people because they're your neighbors. Why would we have to say, why would we have to put the because? Kin and kind. There's the notion that ethics started in kinship, and that the first rule of the ethical person is, and one of the things that they want to talk about animals as being, the animals aren't altruistic. Animals don't take care of other animals. That's completely fallacious, and that's an assumption made by a colonizer. But this notion that one is ethical to this particular creature, not for any particular reason, although bioethics may have started in there in that way, that kin and kind are related. One hopes and one thinks that in 2022, we will have moved beyond that. Gary Francione, an attorney himself and who suffers fools not very well. Like racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, classism, all other forms of human discrimination, speciesism involves violence inflicted on members of the moral community where the infliction of violence cannot be morally justified. How what is unfolding in the Ukraine can at all, in any kind of way, either be justified might there be other possibilities? We can't unwrite history of the last 3 days. What does one do with the messy world that we are now making messier? And maybe you say, well, it's not us. To what extent can we make some kinds of decisions around this? What other relations might exist between human and non-human animals? I walked into our house some years ago, where my husband and I live, and there was an IKEA cowhide on the floor. I looked at it. I said that it had been there for years. And I said to myself, Tim, what are we doing with this on our floor? So much of the real decisions of our lives passes unseen. Again, back to my original question, whose voices are we using when we think that we're using our own? There I am in 2000 decorating my house, and whose voice am I using that told me that it was appropriate to use a cowhide, some creature's skin, in my house? We have great offense. We take great offense at the stories of the Nazi regime and the way they did similar sorts of things. Is there a difference? Of course, there's a difference. The question is, the difference there is not the one that I think people think. 3 possibilities. Abolitionism maintains that all sentient creatures, humans and non-humans, share a basic right, the right not to be treated or owned as the property of others. Does that include pets? As Peter Singer says, does that include ending factory farm? And you say, well, that's going to put out of life 96% of biomass, which is cattle. They said that may be, but cleaning up the history that we have made is essential that we do that. Peter Singer in 1975, Animal Liberation. And I remember being a youngerish person then looking at this, saying them at one point there, he talks about wearing leather. And I said, this man's a crazy man. From a utilitarian perspective, calling for some kind of legislated equality. And we are into some places to that particular place. And my point earlier about DC and PETA and the Humane Society, there are lots of wonky kinds of situations where laws, or DC can have better laws for dogs on leashes, et cetera. And we can pat ourselves on the back that we are treating these animals better. But Tom Reagan, for example, Animal Liberation would say, just by making a cage bigger does not. And if at the same time you hear the argument about mass incarceration and the 33% higher increase of Black Americans who are incarcerated over any other person in the States, and you hear the same kinds of arguments, you should, because they're related. Zoopolis, a political theory of animal rights. looks at this notion of, you know what, there are three basic sorts of animals. They're the animals that come with us, and you can look out your window, you can see the deer, you can see the squirrels, you can see the pigeons, even the bears that now come with us, that they move with the human community. And these aren't necessarily what we would call wild animals. They are largely domesticated. These are the deer that come and eat our salad bars in our gardens. So Hal Herzog, in a punchy book, and he's a confirmed meat eater and a non-vegetarian person, but he will ask, and he calls it a moral schizophrenia. This is the legacy of domination. We love, we hate, we eat, because, to borrow from President Obama, we can. Some we love, at least in the West. Some we hate, at least in the West. Some we eat. The point here that I would make in a different class, this creature here is more intelligent than this creature here. This creature here is one of the most altruistic species, not only for its own young, but for the young of others. We start with dominion, and to be clear, a misreading of Genesis that favors those who need to misread it. When Jesus says to the Pharisees, here's the law, how do you read it? You understand that the word intelligence means reading between the lines. That's what the word from Latin means. Is that any text can be proof texted. Any text can mean exactly what we want it to mean, which is why we have attorneys. But so these are the effects that we're talking about: sentimentality. What Carl Lorenz talked back in the 50s is kind of their kinder. Looking at there's a certain kind of wide face that draws on a certain kind of capacity, not only for human animals, but for non-human animals. Cruelty. This is an image in a museum. This is an actual stage image presentation in a museum, watching two dogs, forcing two dogs essentially to ramp up. Again, entertainment, sentimentality. This speaks without saying. If you want to end your meat eating life very quickly, get behind one of Purdue's trucks here on the East Coast. Just drive behind it for a block. These animals here. You may have seen Carl Icahn's legal action against McDonald's because of the way they treat their pork. We brought him so people would care what happens to us. There is that. So Western culture grows at once more sentimental about animals, also more ruthless. No age has ever been more solicitous to animals, apparently more curious and caring, and we have laws for this, and we have laws for that, and we have laws for the other thing. And yet the astonishing number of animals killed for our pleasure of all kinds and disregard. I know that you've been reading over the last couple of years about pet marts and pet stores and the number of animals that were bought up during the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, to provide an emotional comfort, a service animal of a different kind, and now how suddenly these animals are being found on corners, they're found outside, they're being discarded. Instagram and PETA, different. But the traffic in cute animal images or horrific animal images, not any different than Milgram's experiments in terms of how humanity and justice, how they use images of torture to provoke. In either case, exploitation is the practice and dominion is the theory. We eat them, we wear them, we emote over them, but do we ever think about them as fellow sentient creatures who share this planet and its resources? People will say to you, oh, you can't know what an animal's feeling or thinking. And anyone who has spent any time with animals, all you have to do is look at it, listen to it. You may not understand the language that you think it should be speaking, but if you pay attention to the language it is speaking, how did we come to understand that humans are in some way unique in the animal world? And if there's lots of questions in my presentation that have no answers, it's because these are the questions that don't get any real dense answers, and one continues to add to them. But human exceptionalism, you see this in all kinds of the human to trample, and we saw it with the colonists. We see it in Christianity, and Christianity in terms of the evangelical notion of go and save all people, a misreading again of the Newish Testament, and even to think about Old and New Testament as if the New Testament somehow replaced or made better what had come before. It's different. But this notion that go and save the whole world in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, however we want to put that, and I'm speaking as a Catholic, the notion is that nothing so needs correcting as somebody else's religion. And this was the colonialists. The Memorial Conference in 2012. The weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. And most of us sit here and go, it took them to 2012 to decide this? Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopi, possess these neurological substratuses. Sometime you can Google it right now if you want, the top 10 species for intelligence, and you will be very surprised what you find. Once we sorted out that humans were exceptions to other animals, when did we start sorting out and hierarching humans into higher and lower places? Genesis again, the original Genesis and Polygenesis. Here's a collar. Is this a different conversation? Or is it a conversation we're having in another kind of way? The collar is 1857, Birmingham, Alabama, and it says on it, collar for horses, mules, and dark African niggers. That's what the collar says. You can Google that and you can find the particular color if you'd like. I'm saying that these are related conversations. I'm saying this is related to what's happening in the Ukraine. And aside, while the 13 colonies were codifying persons as property in the Constitution, they never mentioned enslavement. They talked about it. It was like Downton Abbey, persons in service. Haiti was freeing its slaves. Jeremy Bentham, ethicist, writes this, and this was in 1789. The French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason a human being should be abandoned without redress. It may one day come to be recognized that the number of the legs or the velocity of the skin are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? The faculty of reason? But a full-grown dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversible animal than an infant of a day or a week. But suppose the case were otherwise. What would it avail? The question is not, can they reason, but can they suffer? Jeremy Bentham, noted for, he was the first feminist, the first animal rights consciousness, and this notion of saying that it is not a question of they can reason in any kind of way. It's not a question that they, in fact, are probably, they reason more in this particular world because they need to than human animals. Human animals, we now have machines that do everything for us, but a dog, a cat, or a bird, or an elephant has to make some sense of life, of the world, so that they're going to have better hearing, they're going to have better senses. But the question is, can they suffer? Okay, so despite the liberal and usually sentimental rhetoric about the care of animals, no age has ever inflicted upon animals such punishments with complete disregards. And you can see here, there's a little collapse. And yes, any one of us who have owned an animal understand that animals themselves become, non-human animals become part of a commodity reach into our pocket for income and cash. That's a different issue. But to look at, say, the Friendship Animal Hospital on one block and a block away, to walk over to a major food market and to see the slain animals in the, not unmarked now as animals, at least 20 years ago, you could tell that this was a chicken or that this was an animal. You can't now. And one asks, why are they hiding this from us? Why are they not letting us see that these are animals? Witness scenes to be found on any given day at any modern industrial farm. You drive through some states not far from where I'm sitting here in Washington, and you'll see low, long tin buildings with no windows. And one could ask, what are in those buildings that we're not seeing? Why are there no windows? Consider how our lives are intricately entwined with non-human animals in the myriad ways we command their attention, their devotion, and consider the price they pay. Isaac Bashevis Singer, 1968. In relation to animals, all people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka. Number of animals slaughtered in the United States. Fish, chick, pigs, cows, ducks, sheep, goats. $15 to 30 million laboratory animals are killed annually in the US for testing that can be done without the pain and loss of life. And I should repeat that. Killed for testing that can now be done without the pain and loss of life. And it's the unimagination of the researchers to move into a different category. Percentage of animals covered by the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act back in the 1960s. Percentage of research animals not covered by the Humane Methods of Slaughter. And you say, well, that's just factory farming, and I don't know much about that. 100 to 200 million companion animals. When did they stop saying pets? Interesting. Is it good change, or to simply hide something? It is an acknowledgement that it's a companion animal. 1 to 200 million companion animals live with humans in the US. More households now have companion animals than have children, and maybe that's the point. And pets are not exempt from the effects of dominion. About 10,000 unwanted companion animals are killed each day in the US. This number has increased since the pandemic. It's now about double that. That they have to have shelters that are called no-kill shelters should say something. 7.6 million animals in shelters each year. Euthanized, adopted, returned to owners, remain in the shelters. One thing that I have been noticing in the news recently is there is now a kind of a genre of the news, which is kind of pet and animal stories. And for every pet or animal story that says, well, this animal is waiting for its forever home in such and such a shelter and it's been there for 3 years, you're also going to have on the next page, People magazine or CNN is going to have vicious attack by, I'm going, so what, I'll say it, perverse kind of need are we satisfying here with dominion? We get both the sentimental, waiting for their forever home, and the, oh, this animal's attacking this animal. The number of animals in shelters is shocking. According to the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, 7.6 million, with 13,600 animal shelters scattered across the country, 550 animals per each animal shelter each year. Wildlife. Actually, I want to start over here. This is a slide that I took from my recent, The Sixth Extinction, How the World Ends. Of all the mammals on Earth, 96% are livestock and humans. 60% livestock, 30% human. 10,000 years ago, it was the other way around. 4% human, livestock, I mean, not livestock, but animals, about 80. We have only 4% wild mammals. And so when one hears about animals going into extinction, there is not that there are simply zillions of these creatures. There are not that many. And how do you estimate the killing of, and this is not that particular webinar, but is the number 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion? Is it because of the rising in temperatures that are ruining the way animals, the way they live? Or is it because we are simply taking this particular land and turning it into a freeway, so when the deers cross it to their home, they get killed? Impacts here go well beyond hunting and roadkill, which is if you go down 95 and you simply look at the number of Poor animals who, could they have spared this by, I don't know, putting a fence up? Who knows? Many habitats are poisoned by environmentally disruptive toxins. The worldwide total for the consumption of the industrialized countries, and industrialized countries is the operative word because non-industrialized countries don't participate as much in this. And if we add fish, is clearly in the scores of billions. And I know that this can sound polemic. Is it entertainment or is it sadism? Back to CNN News and back to the viciousness of this animal and oh cute, this poor little animal looking for its forever home and has been sitting in this particular place for 3 years. Animal actors, bullfighting, circuses, dogfighting, roosters, greyhound racing, finding the history of any of these, the horse racing industry, rodeo, sled dog, travel animal acts, zoos. You know, I just read through those quickly, but you can find your own. All you have to do is look at this particular picture. This particular image of a bear, so frightened that it's urinating all over itself. How is this any different than what's being played out in the news today? Because we can, and because we have the power, and because no one does anything to change it. Yes, zoos are changing. Yes, circuses are changing. Ringling Brothers has ended theirs. Some significant dates. 14,000, domestication of animals begins. 1,000, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism again. Nonviolence toward all living beings. A number of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers. Early 1600s, Rene Descartes argues that animals are machines without feelings. 1635, the Parliament of Ireland passes an act against plowing by the tail, pulling by the tail, pulling the wool off living sheep, one of the first known pieces of animal protection legislation. And we probably don't know that a certain kind of cashmere wool is actually being pulled off living sheep as the skin. 1641 in Massachusetts, regulations against tyranny or cruelty towards domestic animals are included in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. 1780, we read this, Jeremy Bentham. Voltaire's response to Descartes: hold then the same view of the dog which has lost its matter, which has sought him in the thoroughfares with cries of sorrow, which comes into the house troubled and restless, goes downstairs, goes upstairs, goes from room to room, finds at last in a study the master he loves, and betokens his gladness by soft whimpers, frisks, and caresses. But yeah, animals don't think. They have no feelings. Or they may have feelings, but they don't express them. There are barbarians who seize this dog, who so greatly surpasses man in fidelity and friendship, nail him to a table, dissect him alive to show you the veins. You discover in him all the same organs of feeling as in yourself. Answer me, mechanist, has nature arranged all the springs of feeling in this animal to the end that he might not feel? So the image of testing, back to the image of testing, the point of using animals as tests is because they are like us. But then again, the excuse that we can use to test them is because, well, they're not like us. Massachusetts. Puritan animal advocates, as I said earlier, believed that cruel dominion was a consequence of Adam and Eve's fall from the Garden of Eden. Protestant Christianity in the main establishes a long historical relationship between religion, reform, and animal protection. And in this reason, Protestant Christianity has a better social justice track, I don't want to say track record, but a better social justice advocacy than Catholicism. No, animals don't use tools. Some of these I'm going to move through here quickly. 1824, founded the Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. 1835, Britain. 1859, Charles Darwin's Origins of Species. We're going to come to that now. John Locke on education. John Locke, I'm sorry to say it this way, but John Locke, he could do one thing, own slaves, enslaved persons. The tendency to cruelty should be watched in children, and if they incline to any such cruelty, they should be taught the contrary usage. For the custom of tormenting and killing other animals will, by degrees, hardened their hearts even toward man. One wonders whether he ever thought about that with relationship to the treatment of the persons who were his property, that he considered his property. Children should from the beginning be brought up in an abhorrence of killing or tormenting living beings. All right. I'm going to move on here a little bit to the Royal Society Prevention of Cruelty. They brought the donkey into court, who was being beaten, and argued, and the judge found in favor of the donkey. So Darwin, with Origins of Species and the Descent of Man, argues that there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. And you see an ad at the time critiquing Darwin. If this sounds like Aristotle, there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, and you see here all the kind of the apologies with the higher animals, and the difference between the man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree, not of kind. The love for all living creatures is the most noble attribute of man. Well, we have seen that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties, such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, and imitation and reason, of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient or even sometimes a well-developed condition in the lower animals. The notion of lower and higher, again, that category. Charles Darwin, privately to himself in his notebooks, animals whom we have made our slaves, we do not like to consider our equal. We talked earlier about how the moral code expands and what we might think about how life can change on this. The moral unity to be expected in different ages is not a unity of standard. And by the way, this is the Martin Luther King's borrowing from Theodore Parker, the Arc of the Moral Universe. That's where he comes out of the same kind of a network. The moral unity to be expected in different ages is not a unity of standard or of acts, but of tendency. At one point, the benevolent affections embraced merely the family, kin. Soon, the circle expanded, including first a class, then a nation, then a coalition of nations, then all humanity, and finally, its influence is felt in the dealings of man with the animal world. 1981, Peter Singer's Expanding the Moral Circle borrows this expression. Animals aren't altruistic. Some quick dates, 1914 to 1966, the commercial use of animals grows tremendously with the beginning of intensive animal agriculture. The ad, everybody needs milk. Then they have to have lactose-free milk. Why? Because, sorry to say it this way, cow milk is not designed for human species. As when I speak to we can talk here about cows, for example, and marketing cows, and how we get milk cows. How do mammals lactate? We can go down this conversation if we like. Most people don't understand that a cow has to be impregnated in order to be having milk. 1966, and then what do you do with the young that is born? 1966, 2016, consumption of intensely farmed animal products booms worldwide, with global meat production rising from approximately 78 million tons 1963 to 308 million in 2014. Again, 60% of all biomass in this world right now are domesticated livestock and animals. '58, the American Humane Slaughter Act is passed, and if you go back and you read it, and you'll see that very little helps any of the animals. 1960, Indian Parliament passes its first national animal welfare legislation. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. Europe, in terms of their constitutions, have taken steps in the Constitution to award a kind of personhood to non-human animals. And I will look at this more directly in the next webinar that will follow on this one. 1964, Ruth Harrison's Animal Machines, which was the first publication to actually address the conditions of animals on industrial farms, helping to galvanize the animal movement in Britain, and which gives Britain's codifying of the 5 freedoms in 1964. One sees here, and I will address it, one sees here a link that is always uncomfortable between the rhetoric and the imagining of different kinds of animals and in different kinds of incarceration. The chain around this creature's neck is the chain not any different of the way that we used to walk enslaved persons up and down the streets of Washington, D.C. Following in 66, the public outcry over the cases of Pepper and other mistreated animals, the American Animal Welfare Act is passed. Gary Franciani will say somewhat crankily that most of the laws we're passing take better care of us than they do of the people that they're passing for. 1970, Richard Ryder, who actually wrote with a British writer with Singer, coins the term speciesism to describe the devaluing of non-human animals on the basis of species alone. 1971, the United States Department of Agriculture excludes birds, mice, and rats, the vast majority of animals used in research, from protection under the Animal Welfare Act. All right, we're going to, what time do we have here? I'm going to move quickly on here. Much of this is legal and law stuff. 1998, again, the EU publishes the Council Directive concerning protection of animals kept for farming purposes, based on revised 5 freedoms. Freedom from hunger and thirst, from discomfort, from pain, injury, and disease, from fear and distress, and to express normal behavior. 3 observations: the cages of the chickens, the pigs, the current Ukraine. Do we treat one situation differently than another? The hybridization of animals, freedom from hunger and thirst, from discomfort, pain, injury, and disease, from fear and distress, and express normal behavior. Oh, do you leave the dog in? Oh yeah, the dog likes his cage. How do you know that? You put the dog in the cage in the morning and you leave and you don't come back for 12 hours. How do you know he likes it? We will see this more directly next time. 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project. And if you're looking for an interesting way of thinking through these things, the Non-Human Rights Project, Google, files the first ever lawsuits on behalf of chimpanzees, demanding courts grant them the right to bodily liberty via a writ of habeas corpus. Back in 1763, for example, in the case of Somerset versus, I think it was Montgomery, the British judge who ruled that an enslaved person brought to London had to be freed because English state law, common law, did not recognize that particular state. This was one of the major outcries that led to the, quote, Revolutionary War, was this understanding that a British law was not going to protect the rights of the South in enslavement. But the point was that the first time they brought a writ of habeas corpus to an enslaved person, the same sort of thing, is that this was the first time that a writ of habeas corpus was brought. And the habeas corpus simply means that produce the body, you have the body. And so it served as a legal way for someone to bring into the purview or the sight of the court a person who does not have legal coverage. 2015-16, major public outcry about Blackfish. SeaWorld announces it ends its controversial orca shows. And we'll see more of this in my next webinar when I talk about expanding the moral circus, the moral compass. So there is movement, there is change. It might be ad hoc, it might be impartial. October 2017, California passes a law forbidding the sale of commercially raised dogs, cats. So very quickly, we've looked at culture's use of animals. What does biology tell us about our relations to the animals? I want to try and do this quickly. What time do we have? Just in a few minutes. The great divide has always been not so much here in the images, but there's a notion that there's the kind of specialness that this is a human person, this is a non-human person. And in the European Middle Ages philosophy and law, animals were generally considered, according to Christian theology, largely derivative from the Greeks. They were seen as lower than human and thus further from God. So the meat bias, for example, that carnivores such as lions and eagles sat at the top of the hierarchy of animals, while vegetarians and domesticated animals sat at the bottom. And just start beginning to pay attention to the way meat is advertised, the way food is advertised, who you see in these ads, what they're eating. We still maintain that meat bias to this day. Joseph Merrick, Elephant Man, I'm not an animal, I'm a human being. If I am trying to do any one particular thing here is to encourage a different way of thinking about the relationship to the creature that's on my lap or on the floor, or even to the creature of, and I said to my husband, you know, we can't have rat poison around the house. I mean, we just can't. For all kinds of reasons, none the less of which is that poisoning one specific species doesn't also poisons all of the other species in the area. Carl Linnaeus' Systema Naturae, for the first time in 1757-58, puts the human being back into this particular map. And his classification of humans as primates, remember that Aristotle had called us quadrupeds, don't figure, understanding Aristotle's in some way we are four-footed, some kind of way, that we are somehow related to these people. Linnaeus classifies humans as primates, identified in the species as Homo sapiens. He guides science on a path that deviated to one with a more religious view. His division of humans according to race, you may or may not know his history of the Homo africanus, the Homo asiaticus, the Homo europaeus, the Homo americanus, the four types of the human. And in the 17th century, you had, and Darwin makes fun of this, he said, you know what, one person had 57 different styles and points of human. But this was the argument that polygenesis was developed by colonialism precisely to authenticate the fact that we could treat these people the way we did for this particular reason, because they were not, quote, human, or not human enough. Homo sapiens, europaeus, americanus, asiaticus, africanus. The Smithsonian Institution's The Human Origins Project, which we're going to look at one slide here in a moment, makes a point. It's a wonderful exhibition. You can find it on the internet. Makes a point that these two species, that these are like bears. You know, we have bears. Bears have 10 or 15 species. We think nothing of it. But there were 19 extant species of the human. Now there is only one. And the Smithsonian says the others have disappeared. Well, these two actually shared the space. And it is because, did they disappear, or did we simply aggress them out of being? Linnaeus, like Darwin a century later, could not find a categorical difference between human animals and other primates. Could not find a categorical difference. There were 19 cognate species of the human. One remains. Did you know? If you look at a map, a biological map, the Linnaean map, you're going to find that right now, Pan, this creature here, has her or his own, because they do gender them, has their own line. They are going to be taking Pan out of Pan and putting Pan into the primate with the Homo. Chimpanzees share a DNA similarity of about 98%, a difference of 1.6%. So the question that we've been asking, how do we understand that humans are in some way unique in the animal world, and not a question that we're going to talk. I'm going to end here, give us some time, at least for some kinds of preliminary questions. And I apologize first for having to do this in such a spotty kind of way, because there is so much particular history. I do not apologize for making the kinds of links that I'm making between situations in social history as well as current military history. I think Dominion is still the problem of the West. Non-human animals are more like us than unlike. And this fact, the major voices of science and philosophy confirm. And that likeness and yet unlikeness is still a difficulty for us.
Awesome. Bravo. Thank you, Edward. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, I'm happy to try and answer whatever question might be. I can certainly, and as I said with Robert before, other times, places, I can offer recommendations. I can talk to us about where to read. My questions is, where should our moral center be? What should our ethical commitment be to? And how do we expand the circle of compassion?
Let's see, Edward, there was a question that came in from Patty. She says, are you familiar with Pope Francis? I'm not sure how you pronounce this. Laudato Si encyclical?
Yes.
Does that make any sense? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. If you're familiar with that, and if you have any.
Patty had some very good suggestions to make on, she was actually talking about the Ukraine. I think this is the same Patty, about the Ukraine situation, and DC Cultural History could be doing something like this. Yes. But yes, Patty, I do. My particular point is I would rather see this being done like now and not in a book form. And Francis will. I mean, he comes from a colonized country. He understands it.
And then this is a question, well, it's actually kind of a half question, half comment, maybe like a rhetorical question somewhat. Why do we always place smart non-human animals, or at least those considered smart by humans, on a higher plane than those not so smart? Why does smartness matter in respect to all animal life? All living creatures deserve respect for their beingness and are not necessarily for the food chain of life.
Well, and that's exactly one of the points that I did not make very clearly, but the Eastern sense that all animals, and Peter Singer's sense of that every species, and Aristotle, every species has eudaimonia, a need to thrive and to be itself, and to bind a child's feet, to put an animal in a cage, to clip a person's parts, or however you're going to do that. All of this prevents an animal from being what he or she should be. The point about again, much of the racialized talk since the Enlightenment, it is specifically Enlightenment, talks about the highest rationality as being the Western norm. And so all animals who did not display that are less than us. Good question. Thank you.
Okay. And then here's an interesting question. This is from Paula. It's always fascinating to read the questions and comments that people have, because they, it's like my favorite part of doing these things is people bring up things I never consider. But here's interesting and a question / comment from Paula. What do you think about people who live in extreme environments where growing produce is limited, and also people who hunt fish in accordance with ancestral practices and beliefs?
We cannot impose a Western culture of life upon indigenous people, period. So my point earlier, and I talked about the Greek Eastern history of ahimsa. There is a kind of collaboration between the hunter and the hunted, and that's a very different conversation. I'm talking here about Dominion and Western culture.
Thanks.
Robert, you're breaking up. So, hi.
That was interesting. And then let's see. This is a question of Dan. So the question was, were there any particular documentary films that you recommend on this topic?
Any films?
Yeah, like documentary films that you think?
I think it's called Unlocking the Door, and it's a story, Unlocking the Cage. And it's a story of the non-human rights project. If you have a pen, Google non-human rights project, The lawyer there who puts together the documentary, it's called Unlocking the Cage. I may not have the right title down. The Blackfish documentary, Speciesism is a very hard documentary to watch. And most of these documentaries are very hard to watch because it affects the way we live. It affects the things that we ride on the freeway, looking at the chicken farms, and we don't see the chickens, so we don't pay attention to it.
Okay, no problem. And yeah, this was a really thought-provoking lecture for me because I'm kind of gradually moving towards becoming a vegetarian. I'm not all the way there yet. Making a lot of progress, but not all the way there. But your lecture, your talk really brings up a lot of interesting things.
Robert, get behind a Purdue truck for block.
Oh yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I see those trucks. Like I was in an Asian market 2 days ago, and they had even the tank with the crabs and the lobsters and all that. I was like, oh gosh.
Oh, a red lobster. We name a restaurant after a lobster that turns red because we boiled it alive to death. That's where the term red lobster comes from.
Oh, go ahead.
No, this is what we need to change.
Let's see. Here's an interesting kind of comment / question from Benita. The New York Bronx Zoo has a 4-star rating for its conservation measures, but continues to allow a lone elephant to live in solitary existence for nearly 2 decades. The Non-Human Rights Project is still attempting to free her, and how ironic her name is Happy. How incongruous is that?
No comment. I agree.
I liked your comment you made about, the cages are getting bigger. I'm paraphrasing, but you basically said, the cages are getting bigger, but they're still cages.
They're still cages, right? I mean, and all of us, myself, in terms of the way I shop, the way I think, that I can always justify, and when Benjamin Franklin talks about it, it's when one is a rational person, it is always easy to have a reason for what one does. And so you see this in terms of the way we think about animal care and more globally. I'm not simply limiting this now simply to animals of 4 feet. And Robert, you and I have worked together on projects that talk about unpacking our own on the social arrogance of a certain kind of life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say, I called Pope John Paul a Marxist, to that particular point, that commodity culture, again, to borrow from Mr. Marx, deprives the person, the worker, of any kind of gratification of his or her life. Very different than Aristotle. And so in that respect, I would say Marx would be an Aristotelian, that every creature deserves the equal consideration to thrive, and that no life should be either demeaned or discredited.
Right. Okay.
I mean, we're going to change our behaviors. There's no question about that. Starting here, starting now.
Okay. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A. Oh, here's Dan posted the information called Unlocking the Cage, a 2016 HBO documentary. I'll post the link for that in the chat. This program is being recorded, so if you joined us late or want to listen to it again, you'll be able to do so. It'll be up on our YouTube page. It probably won't be up on our YouTube page though for a day or two, so you can keep that in mind.
Robert, this is the third in the series, expanding the moral code, sentience, speciesism, and animal rights. And I think we have it scheduled for the end of March. Here's
a question: are COVID vaccines vegan or not? I'm actually not sure about them myself. I don't know. Do you know if the COVID vaccines are vegan or not?
Most of that is not. And again, I go back to something that was with the former president, that even in terms of the use of fetus material in medical experiments. So I can't say anything more than that, but I'm suspecting it's not.
Okay. Let's see, this textile production of clothing that often goes straight to landfill is something we can all influence by not buying into the consumerism. Here's a message from Rose. This is the best webinar I've attended. I hope there are more, and there is a series and they will be presented. I want to know more, even though I'm vegan for ethical reasons. I want to be able to talk more intelligently about these issues. And so thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you.
Someone, Linda says a plant-based COVID vaccine has just been launched in Canada.
Oh, that's interesting, because that answers our question that previous they had not been.
And then Patty said COVID vaccines are tested on 50-year-old aborted fetal cell lines.
Well, that's my point earlier, and that's a whole different particular conversation with the Supreme Court, and even as I say in my ethics class, even any mother knows better than most of the people in the class when her child becomes a human being, because in a commodity culture, not for 30 days after the child is born, postpartum, in terms of the legal apparatus that defines not only species but personhood.
Right. Okay. And then Edward, it's a different topic, but you want to tell folks about the talk you're giving next week for us?
I do, very quickly. This is the expanding the moral code. That's a month from now. That's the third in my animal series. Robert has been instrumental in bringing information to people, and I want to thank him publicly for DC Culture and History. Once a month, I do a series called Reparations, a Call Out, and there are 4 or 5 of them that have been done previously. The one that we'll be doing on Sunday night, March, I think it's 6th, I don't have it in my head, at 5 o'clock will be Mexico, and it looks at 3 or 4 particular instances of why specific culture, persons, California, Texas, Supreme Court are lobbying for reparations around this, for example, the Mexican repatriation, in which 30% of Mexican residents in the 30s were quote shipped home to Mexico, even though they were citizens of the United States. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Robert.
Awesome. No, all the thanks goes to you for your time sharing all your knowledge with us and educating us on these topics. Very greatly appreciated. And let's see, with that, why don't we call it a wrap for this weekend? Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. To all the participants who joined and asked interesting questions and made interesting comments, and especially thanks to Edward, our friend, once again, for hosting us and sharing part of his vast knowledge with us. Edward, you're really giving us education on it.
Assalamu alaikum, peace to all.
Great. All right, well, thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
Bye, Robert.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Be safe.